The date, June 17th, 1972. The conflict. 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at this legendary Washington hotel. Among the 5 men were several former FBI and CIA operatives. The involvement of insider Washington officials was not the only shock, as the scandal traced its way up the political ladder of the Nixon administration. The scandal spurred nationwide dispute over Nixon's impeachment, perpetuating the divisive national debate that characterized America's controversial involvement in the Vietnam War in the 1960s. The scandal had not only political implications, but profound social consequences, as it threatened people's faith in the integrity of American politics. The scandal was named after the hotel at which the break-in took place. Watergate, the scandal that shook a nation.
Months before the November 1972 presidential elections, a White House group of agents aimed at suppressing political leaks in the administration known as the Plumbers infiltrated the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in an attempt to gain information about the Democrats' campaigning strategies. The 5 men, Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, Bernard Barker, James McCord, and Virgilio Gonzalez, were caught by a Watergate hotel security guard while trying to implement telecommunication bugging systems. The group, plus 2 other co-conspirators, Everett Howard Hunt Jr. and George Gordon Liddy, who guided the crew by walkie-talkie, were arrested and charged with attempted burglary and spying. Carl Bernstein, a reporter from the Washington Post, the first newspaper to report of the story, found that a check of $25,000 had been deposited into the bank account of one of the burglars. Deeper political connection was manifested as investigators revealed that the check had been in the possession of Maurice Stans, Nixon's chief fundraiser for his re-election campaign. The 7 men, all part of Nixon's committee to re-elect the president, were convicted in January 1973 and sentenced to 1 to 4 year prison terms. As more information was revealed by investigators, people across the nation, including John Sursa, the judge presiding over the Watergate 7's trials, began to suspect involvement by higher-ranking government administrators.
At first, the American media was slow to cover much of the incident, but as investigations went underway and as higher-ranking government officials were subpoenaed to court, news corporations began to cover the story as it made newspaper headlines. The scandal sent the nation's newspapers, television networks, and radio broadcasters into a media frenzy. Large national and urban publications such as the New York Times, Time magazine, and the Chicago Tribune fervently covered developments in the Watergate investigations. In particular, the Washington Post, whose investigations were led by 2 young zealous reporters, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, posited that the Nixon administration had attempted to cover up the break-in a mere 6 hours after it had occurred. The Washington Post established communications with an anonymous source under the alias of Deep Throat, revealed in 2005 as Deputy Mark Felt, an FBI agent that fed the newspaper information concerning the burglary investigations and could confirm or refute the validity of other source providers. In the midst of the heavily publicized controversy, Richard Nixon, as the incumbent, beat out Democratic candidate George McGovern in the 1972 presidential election, one of the largest landslides in U.S. history due to his well-received promise of peace in Vietnam. Succeeding the trials of the Watergate 7, the Senate formed the Senate Watergate Committee, headed by North Carolina Congressman Sam Ervin, to investigate the administration's affiliation in the scandal. As numerous administration officials were found guilty of perjury and obstruction of justice after being subpoenaed by the Senate committee, Nixon, in April 1973, fired several of his high-ranking aides, namely Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, Chief Domestic Policy Advisor John Ehrlichman, Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, and White House lawyer John Dean, who would eventually testify against the president during his trial. As evidence piled up against Nixon's administration, the government needed a prosecutor outside of the Justice Department to work the case. Nixon's newly named Attorney General Elliot Richardson appointed Archibald Cox to the job. As Nixon's former White House counsel John Dean had famously described, the chain of administration indictments was indeed
cancer growing on the presidency.
Hearings held by the Senate Watergate Committee quickly captured popular attention. 2 prominent television networks vying for coverage rights, ABC and NBC, switched hearing coverage beginning on May 17, 1973 every 3rd day, of which an estimated 85% of American households watched at least one of. On July 13th, White House aide Alexander Butterfield shockingly revealed to the court and to the nation that Nixon had implemented a secret audio recording system in the Oval Office. The manifestation of these tapes was a turning point in the investigation hearings that could either implicate or extricate him from the break-in. Nixon, citing executive privilege in retaining the tapes that contained confidential advice from administration aides, refused to release the recordings. However, both the committee and special prosecutor responded by issuing a subpoena demanding the tapes. The scandal had elevated to a full-fledged conflict that brought into question the privilege of the president over the need for evidence in a convoluted investigation. After arduous negotiations, the White House finally agreed to release written summaries of the taped conversations, to the acceptance of the Judiciary Committee, but to the displeasure of Cox. Frustrated by his specially appointed prosecutor's refusal to drop the subpoena, Nixon ordered Attorney General Richardson to fire Cox on October 20th. Refusing to do so, Richardson, along with Deputy William Ruckelshaus, resigned. Nixon's new acting Justice Department head, Solicitor General Robert Bork, finally dismissed Cox. The conflict known as the Saturday Night Massacre spurred public furor, with some even calling for Nixon's impeachment. After Cox's dismissal, Nixon appointed another special prosecutor for the investigation, Texan lawyer Leon Jaworski. On November 20th, lawyers revealed that one of the essential tapes wanted by investigators contained an 18-minute gap, which the administration had blamed on Nixon's secretary. An explanation that much of the American public doubted. In the midst of a flurry of national criticism, Nixon, on November 17, 1973, held a press conference to clear his name before the nation, famously proclaiming,
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Leon Jaworski persisted that the audio tapes be handed over for investigation. Not only did he, in March 1974, indict 7 former White House officials, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, Mitchell, Coulson, Stracan, Mardian, and Parkinson, for obstructing the Watergate investigation, but the Supreme Court secretly named Nixon himself as a co-conspirator. As public support gradually diminished, the House Judiciary Committee began considering presidential impeachment. Nixon, in April 1974, aiming to appease critics, released a 1,200-page transcript of the recordings marked by profane language and Oval Office discussions of avoiding perjury in court and blackmail money, which only elicited even more social censure. The Supreme Court, on July 24th, deeming the transcripts insufficient, ordered Nixon to hand the tapes over to Prosecutor Jaworski. This was followed by the proposal of 3 articles of impeachment for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress, passed on July 27th, 29th, and 30th, respectively, posing a direct conflict between the Supreme Court, convinced of the president's involvement, and Nixon, determined to retain the presidency. August was a devastating month for the administration, as the audio tape dubbed The Smoking Gun, recorded just a few days after the break-in on June 23, 1972, evidenced that Nixon and Haldeman had contrived to block investigations by lying to the FBI. No longer could Nixon deny his role in the cover-up. He would face imminent impeachment. Compelled by the elimination of any remaining public support, Nixon, in a televised broadcast, announced his resignation on August 8, 1974, ending a presidency riddled with acute public criticism and controversy.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Vice President Gerald Ford was inaugurated on August 9th, proclaiming the conclusion to, as he put it, America's long national nightmare. A month later, on September 8th, Ford issued a full and unconditional pardon to Richard Nixon, acquitting him of any potential criminal charges, and providing a compromise to the scandal that shook the nation. This, however, only generated more conflict, as critics argued that Nixon wasn't justly punished. Ford also, in a televised broadcast to the nation, deemed the scandal
An American tragedy. Someone must write the end to it. I have concluded that only I can do that. And if I can, I must.
Although skeptics argued that Nixon's acceptance of the pardon was itself an admittance of involvement, the former president claimed his innocence until death.
Although President Ford had concluded 2 years of conflict, the scandal's legacy transcended the subsequent decades. Expressions popular to the early 70s used to characterize the scandal, to leak, to cover up, to stonewall, became ingrained into American political vocabulary. Although not necessarily a direct effect of the Watergate scandal, it is notable that no other presidents after Nixon have kept private recordings of White House proceedings. Moreover, the scandal inspired Washington reporters Bernstein and Woodward's best-selling literary account All the President's Men, and Oliver Stone's litigious 1995 film Nixon. Following America's controversial participation in the Vietnam War, during which much of the populace questioned the choices of national leaders, Richard Nixon only exacerbated national division by involving the most respected administrative office in the United States in a scandal that undermined the trust that the American public invested in the government.